Some 80 nations want the territorial integrity of Ukraine to be the basis of any agreement to end 2 years of war with Russia. The call came after a two-day summit on peace in Switzerland, to which Russia was not invited. Moscow's ally China did not attend either. More than a dozen countries, including major non-aligned nations, chose not to endorse the final declaration.
The Swiss summit was the first high-level forum focused on a pathway to peace rather than the war effort. It was also an attempt by the West to involve other countries in peace efforts based on international law.
This is not about right or left political ideas. This is not about northern or southern countries. This is about respect of international law and human rights as foundational principles of our living together.
The consequences of the invasion go far beyond the confines of Europe. Indeed, in many ways, Africa has been the greatest victim of the conflicts, and the blockade of the Black Sea have had devastating impacts on our economies and our standards of living.
The document, signed by 84 countries and other groups, calls for concrete action on three major issues.
The three challenges have been analyzed in detail at the first peace summit: nuclear safety, food security, and the release of prisoners and deportees, including thousands of children abducted by Russia.
But delegates were clear about the summit's limits. Russia wasn't invited. But days before the meeting, President Vladimir Putin laid out his own vision for peace.
He's insisting on capitulation. He's insisting on ceding Ukrainian territory, even territory that today is not occupied by him. He's insisting on disarming Ukraine, leaving it vulnerable to future aggression. No country would ever accept these outrageous terms.
13 nations did not endorse the document, including BRICS members India, Saudi Arabia and South Africa. And several countries accused Western nations of observing a double standard with regards to other conflicts.
We cannot be talking about peace, and here we join South Africa, without mentioning other humanitarian tragedies as the one taking place in Gaza. International law and the UN Charter must be respected in every case.
There was no consensus on how Russia should be brought to the negotiating table, but Zelensky said he was already in talks with several nations about hosting a second summit to continue to push for Ukraine's liberation.
DW's Rosie Birchard was at the summit and joins us now from Switzerland. Rosie, expectations were low going into this summit. What, if anything, did it achieve?
Practically very little, and that's because this summit, despite the fact it was called a peace summit, a peace conference, organisers going in knew that little would be done more than perhaps a baby step, inching along a long path toward peace. And that's because Russia was not at the table here. It was not invited, and it showed no interest in showing up. And in solidarity, its biggest ally, China, also boycotted the talks. But this was really a test of politics and diplomacy within the context of a very fractured world. The war in Ukraine, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has really tested allegiances and divided the globe. Russia, on the one hand, going around the world, pushing its narrative that it's the victim, and on the other hand, Ukraine, and particularly its Western backers, arguing that if Russia is allowed to invade Ukraine without consequences, if one UN member is allowed to violate the territorial integrity of another, that it will have ripple effects, not only for people in Ukraine who are, of course, fighting for their territory, but for the rest of the world. And that's something which really, I think, in the end, as the dust settles in this summit, really is a mixed bag in terms of how did the diplomacy land here in Switzerland.
You described the summit as a test of diplomacy, Rosie. Numerous countries refused to sign the final declaration. What are we to make of that?
Yeah, Ukraine says this is a big success. Volodymyr Zelensky, I was in the press room when he bounded out. He struck a very optimistic tone. He talked about the fact 92 countries showed up from all continents. And indeed, that was historic. It was the first of its kind at the highest level. But really, Terry, that is not the whole story, because some countries which decided to come decided not to put their name on this final communique. So essentially, quite a public snub. And those include diplomatic heavyweights from the so-called Global South, including Indonesia, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, India. And I think that will be seen very much as a disappointment for Ukraine. Still, the Ukrainian president trying to spin this really as a big achievement. And of course, he was saying that, look, other countries may join in future. But really, I think it's in some sense a kind of a tale of two summits here, where you have the Ukrainians saying they've managed to garner international support and showed the strength of it. But on the other hand, we really did see coming to the fore some divisions and cracks.
Rosie, thank you very much. Our correspondent Rosie Birchard there in Switzerland. Let's get some analysis now with Rafael Loss. He's a security and defense expert at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for being with us. Rafael, this summit was aimed at helping somehow to resolve the war in Ukraine. Has it done that?
I think it is a first step towards establishing a second track towards ending the war. It was termed as a peace summit. What we saw play out over the weekend was a creation of 3 tracks focusing on food security, nuclear security, and the release of prisoners and detainees. This is something of an agenda that successive meetings are supposed to build on. The signatories of the joint communique agreed to establish working groups to make progress on these. And so hopefully this is a first step towards a more consolidated effort that will eventually involve other stakeholders as well, that so far chose to abstain from this process.
At the end of the summit, there's a declaration that the delegates were asked to sign. Several influential countries refused to sign it. How significant is that?
That is somewhat significant, but I wouldn't read it as a refusal of the terms of the joint communique. All of those countries have different reasons, I think, to not sign on at this point. Some are dependent on Russia for fertilizers, for fossil fuels, other economic goods. Some maintain close political relationships, including through the BRICS format. Others are hoping to maybe host a next summit that could bring to the table Russian delegates as well, and they don't want to foreclose that possibility by now signing this initial declaration. But I think it is significant that those countries still chose to send representatives to the summit, and that it is a success.
What would need to happen, do you think, to bring more countries on board with the principles laid out in the final declaration, particularly the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity?
I think one of the factors that is being under-discussed is that it's difficult for any country to sign on to an agreement that criticizes a party to a war that seems to be in a good place to maybe win it. Another factor is the US presidential election later this year, more significant maybe even in this first peace summit in Switzerland. Everyone is looking at the US presidential election, its outcome, on what that means for US support towards Ukraine. If that recedes under a future, for example, Trump administration, then Russia could continue gaining ground in Ukraine, and few countries would be willing then to criticize the potential future victor in this ongoing war. But it calls into question, of course, the so-called rules-based international order. We've heard from several so-called Global South representatives in Switzerland that this is not only an imagination of the Western countries, but that it is a foundation for how international relations should be structured for the benefit of everyone.
Now, Russia seems to be planning on a long war in Ukraine and hoping that support for Ukraine will peter out. You've suggested that the momentum right now is on Russia's side. Is that how you see it?
Ukraine has been able to stabilize the front line over the past couple of weeks since the US decision to supply additional military aid passed through Congress. European countries have upped their support in significant ways as well, looking at the area of air defense in particular. There's progress to be expected. But as Volodymyr Zelensky said, Ukraine is not yet in a position to reverse Russia's gains. And that leaves Russia with few incentives to come to any kind of negotiating table when it is banking on a US presidential election that might return Donald Trump to the White House, who has threatened, one must say, to end the war in 24 hours, assuming that this means forcing Ukraine into giving up.
Rafael, thank you very much for talking with us today. That was Rafael Loss of the European Council on Foreign Relations.